Welcome to Standard 9C. The goal of this standard is to describe the evolution of the nature of work and the labor force. By evolution, we mean the change or development of something. In this case, the change in the nature of work and the labor force. And we're really looking at that change in a number of different groups. We're looking at it in the family, on the status of women, in the status of children, as it affected the slave trade, and in the development of labor unions. So we really have quite a bit to cover in this standard. The essential question we'll start off with is, how did the Industrial Revolution impact the lives of women, of children, and of families? Some essential understanding to help us with that question. Agricultural economies, agricultural meaning farming economies, they were based on the family. You can think of the farm as a business, and the parents were the bosses and the kids were the employees. That model was what the farming agricultural economy was based on. The Industrial Revolution is going to change that. Okay, part of the Industrial Revolution was kind of moving people out of rural country areas from the farms into the urban city areas. So the Industrial Revolution is going to have a major impact on the structure and the function of the family. Okay, and as a result of that, the Industrial Revolution is going to place new demands on the labor of men, women, and children. Things that weren't demanded of people back in the farming economy, the agricultural economy, are now going to be demanded of them in this new industrial economy. Okay, so our first piece of essential knowledge is we want to know the following things about the nature of work in the factory system. Okay, first thing we want to know is that the factory system displaced the family-based cottage system. Okay, we had the cottage system, which was based again on families largely working in and around their homes. If not physically in their home, work was done fairly close to home. Families didn't typically leave to go far away to different places to work. Okay, the factory system is going to displace that. Work, instead of being done, as we see in the picture here, by a family at their home, now the work is done in a factory. Many strangers coming together under one roof to do the work that used to be done by these same people, but in their homes. Okay, again, to displace is to replace or move out of the way. So the factory system replaced, moved out of the way the cottage system. Okay, second piece of knowledge about the factory system is that the conditions were harsh. Okay, these were not pleasant working conditions in these factories. Factories, 1800s, there's no central heating, there's no air conditioning, there's really not too much thought given to the comfort and more importantly the safety of the employees. Men competed against women and children for wages. Okay, in other words, the pay, it was kind of a cutthroat environment. Okay, where men and women and children kind of competing, really a race to the bottom for who would do these jobs for the least amount of money. Okay, so we see men there in the factory, we see women here in this factory, we see children here in this factory. Okay, our third piece of information here, we alluded to it just before, is that child labor was a major part of the factory system, and children such as these, they were employed because they kept profits high by reducing the cost of production. Kids typically are going to work for less money than adults. Okay, they also were willing to do these jobs that they were kind of ordered to do with less questioning, less talk back to the boss than maybe an adult. As you look at these faces, all of these kids are younger than you. You know, it's not because they're old black and white pictures, but every one of them just looks so much older than their years. These are pictures from about 100 years ago in the United States of kids who today would be in school, but back then were working these jobs in factories. Okay, and the last bit of information about the factory system is that the owners of the factories, they had a lot of control over the lives of their workers. The picture you see here is what we call a company town, a factory town in southwestern Pennsylvania, a town called Schoaf. And this was a picture taken of the town about 100 years ago. Here we see the mill. Okay, and we see all those houses were built for the workers. They paid rent to the company to live there. We notice this building over here was the store. The store was owned by the company. So in other words, the people lived in the town, but they paid rent to live in the town, to work at the factory. They got paid by the factory, but then they could only spend money in the store that was owned by the factory. So in other words, all the money went back to, in some way, the owners of the factory. The factory owners had a good bit of control over their workers. Okay, our second piece of knowledge here were the social effects of the Industrial Revolution, how it changed society. The first thing we see is that women and children enter the workforce as cheap labor. Okay, women and children were typically paid less than men. Again, a trend that continues, unfortunately, until the present day. Children, though, have largely left the workforce. Okay, women have remained in the workforce, but we see that movement into the workplace during this time. Okay, we have the reforms, as we just mentioned. Children have largely left the workforce, largely because of reforms made to end child labor. Society kind of woke up to this sort of negative side of the Industrial Revolution, which was using kids, very young children, to do these dangerous jobs. And society has kind of evolved to a point of saying, you as a student, you should be using this time to improve your mind, to develop your talents and your interests, so that you can do what you want to work-wise when you become an adult, not be kind of forced into a job at 6, 7, 8 years old. That's really all that you're trained to do. We see a poster here, part of the effort to end child labor. Okay, our third thing here is kind of a continuation of that point. Society's not going to let young people just run around unsupervised. Okay, kids who are working in factories, we now start using education as not so much control, although I guess there is an element of that, but the change in mindset that these kids who maybe a generation earlier would have been put to work in the factories, they're now working in school. Okay, they're working, though, to improve their lives and improve their opportunities in their futures. Okay, another thing is women enter the workforce. There's a saying, money is power. And as women were starting to make money working in these factories, doing these jobs and taking on these responsibilities, they wanted political power as well. Women increased demands for suffrage. Suffrage, I find, is one of those words students have a hard time with because it doesn't sound anything like what it is. Suffrage is the right to vote. Okay, so women who are now getting economic power before the early 1900s didn't have political power, couldn't vote. Okay, so we see these two women here with their signs protesting for voting rights or suffrage for women. Okay, another piece of essential, or another essential question we're answering in this standard is, how did the Industrial Revolution affect slavery? Okay, so we want to know these impacts on slavery. Okay, the cotton gin, as we saw in Standard 9A, increases the demand for slave labor on American plantations. We can see here on this map that the cotton was a crop that really wasn't that widely grown in the southern United States in 1820, largely one area there in South Carolina. But the cotton gin, one of the side effects of the cotton gin was an increased demand for slaves because it made demand for cotton go up. More planters started growing cotton, and we can see the rapid expansion by the outbreak of the Civil War in 1860, how much more of the states were growing cotton, and that increased demand for slaves. Okay, we see it here on this chart here as cotton production went up between 1800 and 1860. Likewise, the same thing happened to slaves. Okay, we see slavery under 1 million people as slaves, okay, to about 4 million slaves 60 years later. Okay, both the United States and England are going to take efforts to end slavery. England does it a little bit quicker through legislative means. The United States, it's going to take the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment in the late 1860s to bring about an end of slavery. And to outlaw means to make it illegal. Okay, and the last bit of essential question we're looking at is, why did workers organize into labor unions? Another social effect was the beginning of labor unions. And workers organized these unions, these groups of workers, to fight for improved working conditions and for workers' rights. To a modern day employee, in most cases, the idea of being forced to work 14, 16-hour day for very little money with no concern for safety, those things have largely been taken care of through laws. There are still cases where that happens, but things like the 8-hour day, things like a minimum wage, safety standards for jobs, these are things that largely came about through these groups of workers pushing for their rights and better working conditions. Okay, so we want to know about the rise of labor unions. Okay, so the couple things we need to know here is that workers organized strikes. Okay, and the strike was one method that unions used to push their demands. By walking off the job, by not showing up to work, strikes slowed down business, stalled assembly lines, and oftentimes the boss, the company, then had to meet some of the demands for increased wages, increased or improved working conditions. Okay, we see these guys here in the picture out on strike. Okay, so the strike was an effective tool used by labor unions. Lobbying for laws, and to lobby is to make the case for changes in laws, asking government to pass laws that improve the lives of workers, including women and children. For example, laws to end child labor, okay, were the results of lobbying government at different levels. Okay, that was another tactic used by unions. Okay, and then another one was called collective bargaining, and this was one of the strong points that the unions had. If an individual employee went in and asked the boss for a raise, it might be very easy for the boss to just say, no, get out of here. But if 100 workers collectively together went to the boss and demanded a raise, okay, and threatened to walk out and quit if the boss said no, they had a little more power that way. So collective bargaining was a negotiating strategy, a policy where the union tried to get a deal for all the workers at the job. Okay, so that strategy of between labor and management was a big part of the labor unions. Okay, and that concludes Standard 9C.